Howdy, howdy, Sea Devil here, and welcome to a video where we're going to discuss stratification, which is something I've been saying over the past few videos when it comes to testing units in the 400 and under gold and the 401 to 600 gold, how units stratify and where I think they should be and why I think it's important that they're intuitive, and sort of the mechanics that you see and what they should mean to people who are just coming to the game to make this game more friendly for new players, very specifically for new players, and more intuitive to all players who are playing the game, because many times I've seen even very good players just don't, because they don't do as much testing. They rely on some of these ideas when they're playing factions maybe they're not so experienced with, or anything like that. They'll say, well, this should be a pretty decent unit in this matchup, and it turns out it isn't. But they can make up for that with just really good play, and this is something that new players can't do, is make up for these things with a really good play, because they don't understand the game. So the units have to be intuitive and to make sense. Now, something I've mentioned a few times is I love the way Bretonia is structured, and I think Empire is the worst example so far of stratification gone wrong. So I'll just go over that quickly, and then I'll go over what I think some of these things should mean and what the consequences should be to keep them intuitive. And this is just a discussion. This is just the start of a discussion. It's not a really put together video. I just wanted to start the discussion and hear from you guys and what your thoughts are, and start the discussion. Maybe eventually I can make a more meaningful video. Is something that I would like to think of in terms of balancing and really the foundational principles of balancing in this game is things like this should be intuitive according to what their labels are. So when I did the 400 gold and under value testing, the units sort of stratified like this. I got the Bretonians sort of highlighted in green. Number 2 in terms of value was the peasant mob. And this is exactly where I think a unit like this should show up. They're very cheap. Now, peasant mob, I mean, you fart in their general direction and they will rout. You hit them with missiles and they'll rout. You charge them once and they'll rout. They're very low leadership. But if you let them go, you let them get a rear charge on a cannon, they'll actually take it out. You let them kind of get into an engagement, they'll do very decently. You take a charge with a peasant mob instead of let anything else in the entire Bretonian roster except the peasant mob, another peasant mob, you actually come ahead, and they have their value, but they're actually, you just let them fight, you let them do their thing, they're going to pull value. And then coming in next in this pantheon of Bretonian units is the basic men-at-arms at 250 gold. Then coming in next is the men-at-arms as shield. They're a lot further down. You've got to give something up to get those shields. Then further down in the infantry engagement is the spearmen-at-arms. Spearmen-at-arms is not going to be as good in an infantry engagement as a men-at-arms or a men-at-arms with shields, and that's how it should be. And then even further on down the line is a spearmen-at-arms with shields. They're quite a bit more expensive than the spearmen-at-arms, but they pull a little less value in an infantry engagement, and this is what you would expect because they get the shields. This is how units should stratify, where in terms of intuitive performance in a specific task. And this specific task I was testing was an infantry fight. Now, if I was testing a versus large, I would expect the opposite to happen. I would expect spearmen-at-arms to be at the top, and then spearmen-at-arms with shields, and then, maybe we get, men-at-arms with shields, and then peasant mobs because of their leadership. I don't know exactly how it would go, but that's what I would expect to see, something like that. Now, when I look at Empire is actually completely backwards, meaning that their very top unit in an infantry engagement is a spearman, and 400 gold and under is a spearman with shields. Then comes their swordsman, then comes their spearman. Now, the swordsman and spearman are sort of in the right order. I mean, the spearman should come behind the swordsman. But the spearman at shields being better than the swordsman in an infantry engagement means that there is no reason to ever get a swordsman or a spearman in the lineup for Empire, ever. Unless your gold works out so that you just have 300 left and not 375, or you have 400 and you just, instead of getting a chevron, maybe you want to do the swordsman, but I would get the chevron for the spearman. But, there's just no reason, because you get the shield and you get the anti-large and you get the charge defense against large, and it's cheaper than the swordsman. There's no reason to ever get an Empire swordsman or an Empire spearman. The only unit you would ever get is a spearman with shields. Now, what this does is this makes this, I think, we've done the testing and we've kind of looked at this, and now I understand this very clearly, but a new player is not going to understand that. They're going to say, if I want a cheap infantry on infantry unit, I'm going to grab myself a swordsman. If I want a spearman that's going to protect my edges, or some anti-large that's going to protect my edges, then I don't need to worry about missiles. I'm going to get a spearman instead of a spearman with shields. So they actually, by picking these units based on their intuition and what the unit says, they're actually doing themselves a disservice, because they're picking a worse unit and they're going to have a worse performance, which is going to make the game less interesting and make it less likely for them to stay and play the game. This is why this is so important to me, and it's an issue that it matters. It really does matter. Now, I've really focused on just the Dao for, the better part of 2.5 years as to how I think they stratify and how I think their units are. I've talked about the miners a lot, dwarf warriors with great weapons, longbeards with great weapons, and sort of these units. And this testing has been good because it's sort of expanding this idea, and maybe it'll make it a little bit more interesting to more people who are passionate about Empire, or because I'm sure there's Empire players who would love the swordsman to be sort of a reasonable pick, and they would love that for these things to sort of make sense. And when I've tried playing Bretonnia, even though they have great infantry down here, they're extremely hard to play because they're so susceptible to fear and terror, and even without fear and terror, their units are always routing and coming back. They're a difficult unit to play, even though they have good stratification and good units at this tier. I mean, this tier is susceptible to very many ways. There are a lot of ways to counter low tier infantry aside from just beating them up, based on how you play the game. But this is the basic problem as I see it. And when I look at really how things should play out when it comes to when a unit is described in its tooltips, it should really be telling the truth, in terms of it should make sense within the faction and between the factions. So I'll go over to this basic chart just to sort of explain what I mean. Now, this is not a tested, and I don't have precise numbers, and it's really the concepts and ideas that I want to talk about, and just so that it makes sense. So when you say a unit is anti-infantry, it's in the tooltip, they're anti-infantry, they should have better melee attack and weapon damage against infantry, compared to a unit that's not anti-infantry. And they should perform worse against large. It's just, I shouldn't put this here. I should put minus like that. They should actually perform worse against large and better against infantry than just a plain unit at the same price that is not anti-infantry, right? There's got to be some kind of cost for that anti-infantry, and maybe it's missile defense, maybe it's health, maybe it's versus large. Whatever it is, you get this anti-infantry, but you have to pay a price to get that designation. Same when we go with damage dealer. Damage dealer, you would expect a damage dealer to have much higher melee attack, a lower melee defense, higher weapon damage, lower missile defense and health. And you would expect them to be the glass cannon. And I think a great example of a damage dealer that I don't know if they're even designated as damage dealers are slayers. They're vulnerable, but if you let them go, they can do a ton of damage. And this is the idea that if you're picking a damage dealer, you're thinking of glass cannon. You just want something that is going to mow through anything. And if they are not dealt with, they will be devastating, right? That's the idea of a damage dealer. When you say you're going to be shielded, well, you should get less melee attack. significantly less, but a little bit more melee defense, less weapon damage, and more missile defense. If you've got a silver shield, you should get a lot less melee attack, a significantly more melee defense, significantly less weapon damage, significantly more missile defense. And there's the trade-off. That is where the trade-off comes. If you're anti-large, well, maybe you get less melee attack and less weapon damage, but a big bonus versus anti-large. And when I say this, if you got a bonus for versus large of 20, maybe you get minus 10 melee attack, minus 10 weapon damage. So that you actually, the idea is the bonus is the cost of the bonus is not as much as the total bonus. So it's not devastating to have anti-large against other things, but you really win when you get it on the right unit. Armor piercing, and this is where I think armor piercing really intuitively should be that it should split at 50 armor. If you're a non-armor piercing unit, you should do better than an armor piercing unit below 50 armor, and above 50 armor, an armor piercing unit should do better than a non-armor piercing unit. So you should see in the infantry testing or large testing or whatever it is, if you have a non-armor piercing unit and you're facing up against a unit that has 20 armor, you should definitely do better than an armor piercing unit at the same price. That's just, it should be straight up, you should do better. And that should and the way that should work is take place through the weapon damage has to be high enough in terms of the total weapon damage to make up that difference. And that's actually quite easy to do. But it's when you have like armor piercing units that are better than non-armor piercing units, even when you're facing something with 0 armor, that's a problem. Right? And when you have non-armor piercing units that are better than armor piercing units, even though something has 100 armor, again, that's a problem. Really, I think 50 armor is pretty intuitive. Really, you might not notice a whole lot of difference when you're fighting something with 50 armor, whether you have an armor piercing and non-armor piercing unit, and you really start to notice the difference at 20 armor or 80 armor, 100 and 0. Like that's where you should notice that difference, but that's what armor piercing should mean as intuitive when you have the fear and terror mechanic. Now, I don't know if all these things need to be negative. I'm not saying that, but you need to pay for your fear and terror with maybe melee defense, melee attack, weapon damage, missile defense, health versus large, whatever it is. And then there's other things like the aquatic trait, Vanguard, Rampage, but you should always gain more than you lose when your mechanic takes place. So, for example, if your unit starts to rampage, and I think this would, I think they've missed, CA has missed the boat a little bit on rampage, because it could be a better mechanic. When a unit rampages, if you're going to lose control of that unit better demolish things. That's my feeling. Like, if you're rampaging and you can't control the unit, give it significantly more melee attack, melee defense, weapon damage, whatever it is. So that if they happen to rampage on the right unit, they're going to demolish them. If they happen to rampage on the wrong unit, which they do often, at least they won't. It'll still be bad, but it won't be quite as bad. Same with if you have aquatic. When you're in water, normally you lose 20% of your melee attack. Well, maybe an aquatic unit should only pay for that with 5% of its melee attack. So that you start with the aquatic trait with 5% less melee attack or something small, but if you happen to be in water, you get a lot more. Same with Vanguard and all these other things, like these basic things they have to have a cost. If you're going to Vanguard something, and maybe it's just you have the same unit, it costs more gold. Whatever it is, and these things need to make intuitive sense. Then there's the faction mechanics, whether it's High Elves, Dark Elves, Tomb Kings, they sort of have their faction mechanics. They need to pay for that with something. And now, I think they've done a pretty decent job on that, in my opinion. And I think really the Dark Elves have been top tier, and they have the units to be top tier always. I don't know that they'll ever not be top tier because of the way their units are structured. Because they have cav, they have great infantry, they have defensive, they have some decent enough defensive units, they have great ranged, the only thing they're really missing on are artillery. They have some monsters, they have flyers, they're never going to go anywhere, but their faction mechanic needs to cost them something. Then there needs to be sort of basic faction considerations. Like, for example, the vampire counts have no ranged. So at the cost of having no ranged, that is one place where they're going to be vulnerable. The rest of the faction needs to be lifted up somehow. Compared to, say, like Tomb Kings. The Daoi they have no cavalry, have no monsters, have no magic. So something else needs to take that place, and part of that is the Daoi have outstanding infantry, outstanding ranged, outstanding artillery. Like this is the cost for it. Chaos doesn't have a lot of ranged options either, but their armor-piercing infantry is second to none. They're just outstanding. That's kind of the faction considerations, I think, because when you look at the Daoi have the very best armored defensive infantry, and that's the way it should be. You should not have defensive armored infantry from a perfect example is from from the Greenskins be as good as the Daoi, and you see that it's not the case. Like the Greenskins do have Orc Boys, which are decent, but they're not as good at the very same price as the defensive infantry of Dwarf Warriors. At the same price, they're both 450 gold, but the Daoi are just better, just straight up better at the same price and the same role. And although the Orc Boys are still pretty decent, but this is how things should stratify in terms of faction considerations, because the Orcs have monsters, they have magic, they have cavalry, they have all kinds of other things that make up the rest, and they have, of course, the wall, which is amazing. So you see that the faction considerations should come into place in terms of how the faction should play and feel, and actually they've done a really pretty good job on this for the most part, I really think, especially now you see the Vampire Coast has come out. Then finally, that's when you have all these things right? When you have all these things correct, your anti-infantry does make sense. It is definitely better in terms of a non-entrant anti-infantry unit. A damage dealer is a damage dealing unit. Then you look at the overall balance after all these things are considered in terms of one faction compared to another, and you can tweak those up and down in terms of whether you alter the faction mechanics, some key abilities within that mechanic, units within that tend to pop out and be really, really good in the matchup, or health, or whatever it is. You have minor tweaks to sort of bring the factions to a total relative parity. Now, you're always going to have the rock, paper, scissors mechanic, meaning that, the dwarfs beat lizardmen beats dark elves beat dwarfs, or whatever it is. There's always going to be that sort of mechanic in play, and it should always be in play. It should never be that every faction is good against every other faction. There should be hard counters, and there should be factions in general that you're really good against. Now, there are some factions that really don't have a lot of hard counters, and they tend to be top tier all the time, like Chaos and the Dark Elves. But I mean, they're sort of your all-arounders, and it is what it is. But a lot of the other factions do have some hard counters, and they're hard counters to others, and I think that makes the game very interesting. So you look at, once you have all of this stuff correct, that's when you look at the overall balance. Now, how did these things, like, someone asked me, well, how did it get like this, where you had Empire, which is backwards? You have this weird thing where spearmen with shields are above swordsmen and everything else like that. Well, Empire is a good example, because they started where their infantry was ridiculous. At the very start of the game, Empire greatswords were absolute beasts. They were monsters. They crushed, and Empire was the best faction by, I think, by a pretty good margin in the early game. And part of it had to do with the way that their infantry was, and they started changing that and bringing in other infantry, and then game 2 changed a whole lot of things, because it really changed it added health to all the units and all the factions, and it skewed battles towards melee defense instead of melee offense, and it did kind of a lot of things to change. And Empire went from being absolutely dominant in game one to pretty weak early in game two. Then they started tweaking up things here and there to try and get them back into balance. You know, Empire has always been a high skill cap faction, and they still are. And I think Empire is the example, which is really a good anchor for balance, because they have everything. I mean, they have monsters, no, not many. They have artillery, they have magic, they have kind of some interesting units. They have varied infantry, they have varied range. You know, they're a very good faction to sort of balance everything else off of, in my opinion, because they have very good magic and everything else like that too. So, you know, the fact that they're sort of gacked up like this is bad for new players, and it's bad for the game, I think, in general. And you know, Bretonnia's never been a sort of a top tier faction, I think. You know, I mean, I could be wrong in that. I mean, I haven't paid attention to exactly where they have been in the meta, but I know they've been weak for a long time, and I think they're kind of better now than they've been in a while, but I still don't think they're quite where they're at. And you know, some of that may be their battle pilgrims, I think, are a little bit undervalued, and I know they've been working really hard with some of their other units, and it's a hard faction because Bretonnia is a very high skill cap faction, in my opinion, because you need such intense micro to be able to manage these low tier units to get their full value. Because a peasant mob is a great unit. I mean, have no doubt, the peasant mob is number 2 out of all the units at 400 gold and under. They're a very good unit, and they can do many things, but you have to be fantastic to micro them correctly, to get them into the optimal situations, or to save your other units, and to catch them after they rout, to bring them back, and to do these things even with spearmen, men-at-arms, and all these other units. So that's why Bretonnia is such a hard faction, that I think, to play really well, but it can be played really well. And you do see Bretonnia showing up in top-tier tournament play, top-tier play periodically, because extremely good players can actually get the full amount out of Bretonnia, because aside from having all these units that are going to be routing all the time in the front line, they're a heavy cav faction, so you're going to be wanting to cycle charge them pretty frequently. So, you know, you're going to have 4 to 6 units of cav cycle charging, plus you're going to have some you know, constant routing of your units. But, you know, I think they stratify very nicely. These are intuitive. Someone who is going to play Bretonnia will not be disappointed in how these units play. You know, they will make sense that, oh yeah, well, peasant mob is really cheap, but you know, it can get in the way of a charge for battle pilgrims, and I've made all my money on that 100 gold. So anyways, this is sort of the start of a conversation. I don't know the best way to present this in terms of, you know, sort of a you know, a more produced video, because it's more than just a stream of thought. I mean, I've thought about this obviously a lot, and I know lots of you guys have thought about the same thing. How do these units play out? Why are they where they are? And I know as we go and do testing from 601 gold and up, we're going to see more of these weird things happening, where you have some factions that stratify very nicely, and some that are sort of weird, like Empire or the Beastmen. They don't stratify very well. You know, you got, even in here, your Beastmen your Ungor herd is down at 4th from the bottom. You know, your Ungor herd is below your Ungor spear herd, and they're below the Ungor spearmen with shields, and all of them are in the bottom, you know, the bottom third. You know, sort of around where all the undead units are and all the other spears. Like, you know, like the Ungor herd should be at least top half. You know, like that's a perfect example, and or at least in the middle. Like, you know, like Beastmen have a lot of other great units. Like, I get it. Their Centaurs are ridiculously good, and they have some other good units, and they have one amazing lord and another lord who can be situationally very good. And they have the right lords of magic to do some stuff. But this Ungor herd being down here, it's just wrong, you know. This being worse than an Ungor spearman herd with shields, it's just wrong, right? It is just a bad idea, because it's going to it's not good for new players. And this is all this stuff should be intuitive. Like, you can rebalance everything so that top tier players can have a balanced game, while you also achieve the game being reasonably intuitive to new players. You can achieve both of these things. They're not mutually exclusive. Now, some of the ways, again, that Spearman with Shield sort of got here is through these iterative balance changes, where they're just looking at a unit that is underperforming, and maybe it was a Spearman with Shield that happened to be doing very poorly. They buffed them without looking at the Swordsman and the Spearman, and all of a sudden they went from maybe the Spearman with Shields were way down here, sort of down at like 30th out of 30, and they buffed them, and they just kind of overcooked it a little bit. Instead of getting them sort of to the middle of the pack, they should be around 17. They brought them up to sort of 5 out of 31, and that's kind of my take on that's how that happens, is because this is what happens. You look at the overall balance, and I know the stats that some of the stats that CA has shared with us and what they're looking at. The overall balance, they'll look at the win rate of the faction, then they'll look at the win rate of the units within the faction. So they know that, for example, when Empire's win rate's at 45% overall, let's say that's what it is, or maybe let's say the Empire's win rate is 50% overall. They go 50-50 with generally all they play. Yet when you bring Spearmen with Shields, maybe their win rate was 45%. So they say, and when you bring Swordsmen, their win rate was 50%. Spearmen, their win rate was 50%. So they say, well, I need to change this overall balance, and so I'm going to bring up the Spearmen with Shields. Now, what really should be done is I should have maintained the stratification and increased all three of these a little bit instead of one of them a lot. So I pushed them all up. I improved the Swordsman a little, a Spearman a little bit, and the Spearman with Shields a little. And then that number sort of goes to, if I'm using the Swordsman now, my win rate is sort of 51%, Spearman 51%, and Spearman with Shields 49%. Because that might say that players are sometimes using the Spearman with Shields wrong. They're using Spearman with Shields when they don't need them. They're using them in situations where they're not getting good use out of the shields. Like, there are other reasons why that number may be off, aside from just straight up balance. Like, you got to think. I mean, these are actually human players playing, and the collective human decision making does not. The results of collective human decision making doesn't mean that it is right because that's what the average says, because a unit is always underperforming in terms of dragging the faction down does not mean that unit is A, unintuitive, or B, not balanced correctly. Could be everybody in general is playing them poorly, or some subset of group of people that play the faction play them really poorly. And this is an example. Like, if you want Spearman with Shields in terms of the versus Spearman, you need to have a good reason to bring them. If you bring Spearman with Shields just because, you should lose, right? If they're not going to take any arrow shots, right? Like if you brought Spearman with Shields against vampire counts all the time instead of Spearman, that should drag you down. That should be a really bad idea, and that should bring your overall losses down. So this is kind of one of those things where, maybe Spearman with Shields were really quite poor, and maybe they were down at, sort of 24, and they were looking at that number of the overall balance, and they just boosted Spearman with Shields and not Spearman or Swordsman, and that's how Spearman with Shields sort of jumped over top of the two, whereas really it would have been better off to buff all three and a smaller amount, keep them in the correct order, and let the overall balance maintain at 50% for Empire, while you rebalance the units a little bit on the inside of what actually contributes to making that 50%, if that makes sense. Anyways, bit of a ramble. but the start of, I think, maybe another video or two on this. I don't know that I would get to it right away, but I would like to sort of put this together in a more meaningful way at some point. I'd love to hear from you guys what your thoughts are in terms of how units are balanced within their groups. How this sort of adds up to you. Like, this is one of the reasons Nehakara warriors are really, really bothersome. Nehakari warriors are the bottom of the barrel at the bottom of the barrel in an infantry fight at 401 to 600 gold. Yet they designate that they are anti-infantry and a damage dealer. Like, the Nehakara warrior should absolutely chew. They should mow down clan rats. They should absolutely obliterate clan rats. This would be the intuitive part coming through, because they also cause fear. Like, they should just demolish clan rats, but they don't. And they should do reasonably against the Longbeards. Maybe not great, but because Longbeards have very good defense and they're sort of the anti-damage dealer and they have very good armor, but they don't do good against either. They actually do quite poor, and that's why they're at the bottom. And that's why, for me, I think they need either, if you take off the designation of damage dealer and anti-infantry and just set them where they are, and I'm okay. I'm a little more okay with where they are. But if a new player picks up that unit and says, oh, anti-infantry damage dealer, and it causes fear, this unit would be great against something like clan rats. But it turns out they're not. They're awful against clan rats. Well, that's a problem. So, anyways, I'd love to hear from you. Love comments. I always say I love comments because I really do love comments. this is what makes this hobby worth doing, is the conversations we have in the comment sections. And so many videos I've done have been because of comments. So many improvements to videos that has been because of comments. And I've learned so much as a player, and I guess I'll say air quotes YouTuber, because I don't know that I'm that, but I've learned so much from talking to you guys and just having the conversation as to looking at these sort of things. And I would really love to hear from you. Are there other ways of looking at this? Is this the way that you would look at it? How would you like to see this sort of topic discussed? What would be a better way to explain it? I know typically one of the most difficult things I find is, for me, it's easy to explain this kind of stuff to you guys, because the people who watch, who kind of are in the comments and subscribe to this channel, I can get it. They're very, very technical people that watch these videos. If you're watching spreadsheet analysis, you're probably a technical person. So when it comes to explaining these things and discussing these topics, it's actually quite easy to discuss this topic with you guys. But when it comes to explaining these topics to maybe a lay person, someone who doesn't do a lot of analysis, who really relies on intuition, it's very hard. It can be very hard to explain this in a clear manner, which is important to me, because it's easy for me to think about, okay, this is why I want to do a test, and this is how I stratify things, and this is what my expectations would be, and this is why, and I try to explain everything and put the testing out there, and try to make the testing intuitive, and try to make the testing at least transparent so you can see what's going on, and make my analysis to try to explain my position and why I think what I think. And most of the people, not the most people, like everybody I hear comments from generally does some sort of analysis on their own, as it is all the time. Anyways, do your own testing and have your own sort of thoughts on how to analyze things. But really, I would like the question that I'm asking here from you guys is, how do we better explain this to someone who may not be so keen on stats, who may not be so keen on the idea of proper stratification being important, who may not be so keen on these things, so that it can maybe give a little bit more insight to anyone who's looking at this, and put it in a way that is maybe not easier to understand, but simpler to explain. if that makes sense. Anyways, I would absolutely love to hear from you guys. I guarantee there's some of you guys are teachers and coaches, and you're presenters in your own right. I mean, I've been an engineer for a very long time, so I've done lots of presentations. I know you guys have also done lots of presentations, so I guarantee in your life you've had to try to explain technical information to lay people. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what would be a good way to explain this concept, through comparative videos, through a prettier spreadsheet. I mean, I don't know. That's why I would love to hear from you guys. So hope you found that interesting, and I will see you soon.